Thank you very much for having me, and thank you so much to the organizers for everything today. What a beautiful collectivity of storytelling and sharing. I, of course, want to start by acknowledging that we are here on Kumeyaay land, and I also want to say a warm mahalo nui to the Kanaka Maoli lands that I in part wrote this piece on, and also the Patwin lands where I live and work. And I'm really excited to talk a little bit about origins and also about storytelling and an extension about nuclearism and radiation. It seems like we are all, in fact, in conversation after all. All right, so in a surface reading, Maori writer Patricia Grace's short story, Sun's Marbles, from her 1994 collection, The Sky People, is two Maori creation histories woven together. She retells, first, the story of Ranginui and Papatuanuku, Sky Father and Earth Mother, respectively, who exist before time, in Po, in an eternal embrace, only to be separated by their children, the gods of the forest, of mankind, and of war, in order to create Te Ao Marama, the world of light, the living world. And second, the history of the creation of longer days caused by Maui attacking and maiming the sun to slow it down. But in an interview with Fijian scholar artist Vilsoni Heroniko, Patricia Grace responds to a question about the political nature of her work by saying that Sun's Marbles is really about nuclear testing and nuclear weapons. It has a parallel in mythology, she says. Maui, sun, and sky are characters, but it's really about how people behave toward each other and toward the environment. In my remarks today, I'd like to outline how Grace's oceanic storytelling addresses Western notions of speculative nuclear futures by returning to and revivifying, in Kataruzling Baldy's terms, oceanic ongoing creations. So predicated on hegemonic rhetorics of isolation, there's where did it go? No, did it work? We're good. Of isolation, experimentation, and insignificant populations, i.e. Henry Kissinger's oft-repeated phrase, there's only 90,000 people out there, who gives a damn? The United States, Britain, and France detonated over 300 weapons, nuclear weapons, in the Pacific Islands and Australia from a period of 1946 to 1996. In these American, British, and French empires, settler colonial discourses on nuclear studies often rendered nuclear war as a non-real and subjunctive yet totalizing event. As historian Richard Klein argued, total nuclear war does not refer to anything that is or has ever been so far. Its real referent is in some still hypothetical future. This framing of nuclear war as non-real and in the future relies on so-called Cold War military strategies and national security policy assumptions where nuclear warfare is a recipe for quote-unquote mutually assured destruction based on a philosophy of deterrence. Yet, the Cold War, as I try to emphasize here today, wasn't cold for the indigenous lands and waterways of the Marshall Islands, of Kiritimati, of Maralinga, of Motoroa, of Whangatofa. The detonations of nuclear weapons on indigenous lands in these settler colonies, trust territories, overseas collectivities are rendered by these colonial powers as quote-unquote tests, as experiments on unincorporated territories. The indigenous peoples on whose lands and whose bodies these detonations were enacted upon were also left without the politics of recognition and the ability to resist in a politically legible way to the settler state. By rhetoricizing nuclear detonations as tests or as trial, the state neither assumes responsibility for its impact nor recognizes its effects and keeps nuclear war as an ever-present future speculation rather than seeing it for its present reality. So in my project overall, I'm also aiming to show how settler colonial erasures happen not just at the level of the body or at the level of the land, but also at the level of the sentence, and at the level of grammar. I make the conscious and political choice in this project to call these nuclear explosions in Oceania as the noun detonations, or the active verb detonate, as in, the United States Atomic Energy Commission detonated nuclear weapons in the Marshall Islands, and the French government detonated nuclear weapons at Motoroa, so as to make no mistake about who the agents are in these relations. Clear and deliberate attempts by Western nations to avoid responsibility exist at the level of the sentence in official government documents, as they did in a 1957 report on radioactive contamination in certain areas of the Pacific Ocean from nuclear tests, released and sold to the public. I think this one was sold for like $2, to the public by the United States Energy Commission. Quote, on March 1st, 1954, an experimental thermonuclear device was exploded at the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission's Enowatok Proving Grounds in the Marshall Islands. Using the passive voice, this sentence has no agent, no actor, and no responsibility. Furthermore, the evasion of responsibility and erasure of Indigenous lifeways is also perpetuated in academic discourses on nuclear proliferation. In the seminal 1984 collection of diacritics on the topic of nuclear criticism, Jacques Derrida's essay, No Apocalypse, Not Now, Full Speed Ahead, 7 Missiles, 7 Missives, argued, quote, nuclear war has not taken place. It is a speculation, an invention in the sense of a fable, or an invention to be invented in order to make place for it or to prevent it from taking place. This emphasis on an unrealized speculation not only demonstrates his continental bias and ignores the nearly 20 years at that point of nuclear detonations in French Polynesia at his time of writing, but strangely also ignores the detonations in his own home country of Algeria in the 1960s. Rendering nuclear impact as a fable infantilizes Indigenous experiences, but also ultimately encapsulates the very narratives of belittlement and erasure that writers like Patricia Grace and activists of the nuclear-free movement are writing against. So after generations of weathering the compounding effects of colonialism, Indigenous writer activists remain mobilized through a series of rhetorical engagements and responses to nuclear proliferation in Oceania. These writings, personal narratives, fiction, and poetry assert targeted responses to Western discourses on the region, while also inserting Indigenous epistemologies, especially those that highlight the complexities of the familial relationships with the environment. Activists from the Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific Movement, NFIP, and the artists that they later inspired, such as Maori writer Patricia Grace, who I'll discuss here today, I argue utilize rhetorics of kinship and genealogy, particularly those of maternity, to bring awareness to the ongoing ecological harm of nuclear proliferation throughout the Pacific Ocean in these archipelagic connections from the Marshall Islands to Maralinga to Kiribati to Te Ao Meohi and to Aotearoa. So for the past 500 years and in many ongoing futures, various imperialist nations, as we've discussed, have viewed and used the Pacific as a space they could claim, conquer, extract, and destroy. Turning to the story now, Grace tells the story of creation of two types of light, to both explain the creation of a world of hierarchy and the creation of radioactive elements. Grace's story begins where other Maori creation stories begin, with earth and sky so tightly embraced that their children, winds, waters, plants, animals, birds, insects, reptiles, and fish, already exist, but they live without a sense of the three-dimensionality that we currently understand our world through. So in the early days, when she and sky were close together, there was no above and below in those days, no direction was different from any other, no vertical, horizontal, diagonal. There was no superiority, and challenge had not yet been born. Grace presents a world without directionality and thus without hierarchy, no superiority and challenge. Grace draws on familial relationships, particularly parent-child relationships, to formulate what epistemology looks like in darkness, even the world before light enters it, is not a space without knowledge, as earth and sky were born out of darkness and therefore knew about light. Their children, in the murky potentiality of Poe, get a sense that light might exist, and their dissatisfaction at being in the dark, as Grace suggests, leads them to separate earth and sky. And once earth and sky begin to be separated, perceptions and direction begin to be understood, the children found out about light. With the creation of Te Ao Marama, also created are up and down, challenge and superiority, hierarchies form, and vulnerability materializes. Grace tells the creation story to explicitly contextualize how the world existed, where humans could have had the idea of superiority and greed that the extractive capitalism and nuclear imperialism require. Just before Grace moves to discussing the crux of the story about how daylight was extended, people are eventually created, and they are Potiki, last born. Earth and sky, who indulge these latest offspring, give them free rein, soon come to realize that with humans, the more that they were given, the more that they wanted. Dissatisfied, rather than curious, children ultimately lead to ecological disaster, and the recurring desire for light further all the actions of earth and sky's children. Grace then moves to retell the creation of another form of light, sun's marbles, which are ultimately the glowing radioactive remnants of the sun hiding in the earth. She retells how Maui assaults the sun, maiming him so badly that the sun hobbled about like an old korua, an elderly man, and from then on took on many hours to travel across the face of the sky. As a side effect of his attack, Sun lost some of his marbles, most of which went skittering out to stardom. Some, however, dropped to Earth, who caught them tidily. Again, Earth, as mother, is placed in a position of having to protect her children. Quote, she didn't really want Sun's marbles because she understood these pretty things could be dangerous. But she couldn't send them back because gravity was so lopsided, so she hid them deep in her pockets. Just before the discovery of Sun's marbles, Grace narrates the changing practices of people toward their fellow siblings and towards Earth, fulfilling Earth's distrust of them. As Earth earlier feared, people begin practicing the tactics they will later use in the pursuit of Sun's marbles on their fellow siblings through a path of ecological destruction and colonialism. And so here's the quote you have here. They'd heard about Sun's marbles and that Earth had hidden them somewhere. At last they found Sun's marbles in Earth's deepest pockets, and with these, they made objects in their own likeness. That is, they made objects capable of enormous destruction that they were not able to be properly controlled. By interweaving the story of the search for the light of Sun's marbles within the larger story of the creation of Te Ao Marama, Grace makes clear that nuclear imperialism is an alternative form or extension of these centuries-old colonial extractive logics. Importantly, Grace is perfectly clear as to where the agency for nuclearism comes from. Sun's marbles are not inherently dangerous, but rather humans are dangerous with their ideology of greed, power, and knowledge at all costs. We humans are the, quote, objects capable of enormous destruction that are not able to be properly controlled. And importantly, Grace is perfectly clear as to where that agency for nuclearism comes from. So Sun's marbles are not inherently dangerous, but that we humans are not the objects capable of enormous destruction that are not able to be properly controlled. So we, according to Grace, are the weapons that have already hurt members of what she calls our own quote unquote tribe. There's no speculative harm here, but rather embodied harm inflicted by members of the tribe on other members. She writes, during the making of these objects, there was so much waste that many of their own tribe had to be shifted away from their homes to make room for it. Many had to run in fear of it. Many had nowhere to go and had to live with it. They became ill and maimed, give birth to sick children, died painfully. She also refutes any minimization of scale that through the anaphora of many nuclear detonations, she makes clear, have harmed many people. By explicitly fusing the histories of Sun's marbles, i.e. radioactive elements and the dangers of the rise of humans over other species, Grace explodes the Western myths of racial supremacy and, quote, mutually assured destruction that fuel nuclear imperialism. She instead reminds her audience that recontextualizing the present through Maori epistemologies and histories, which maintain familial relationships with the environment. So it's important to remember here that in Maori, the word for earth, whenua, is also the same word for placenta. That this relationship with the environment should inevitably lead us as readers to speculate why such devastation was allowed to happen and what, if anything, that we'll do about it. In the end of the story, Papatuanuku, Earth Mother, questions whether it's her responsibility that her children, these bearers of destruction, should be responsible for their own actions instead of acting according to her influence. Quote, but later they began to ask themselves where they'd gone wrong. Was it because of their separation that these children had become so grasping, so out of control? Had sky been too distant? Had earth been too overcompensating? What could they have done about it anyway? Was it all a question of light? Grace's story brings nuclearism back into the ongoing present through active voice and clear narration of responsibility, while Western nuclear politics and nuclear criticism are about deterrence and deferral. Sun's Marbles demonstrates how creation narratives are not about explanation, solving ontological riddles. They're about tracing genealogy and relation. They speak to our common ancestors. By insisting upon the intimacy of relationships, both back to earth and sky, but also among the human tribe, as she calls it, she forces her readers, through her rhetorical questions, to reckon with the question, to whom are you responsible? As a Maori writer, she demonstrates these trans-Indigenous connections of responsibility to other Pacific Islanders who have been displaced and harmed through the multi-generational impacts of nuclear proliferation. Just as we've seen in our contemporary moment at Mauna Kea, at Ihumatao, at Kalailoa, we are reminded of the ability to continue to create these communities of responsibility. And as the Maori proverb states, kamua kamuri, walk backwards into the future. Thank you very much.